We began firing before daybreak, and we fired several hours. After we bombarded the island a while, then the planes came in for bombardment. We backed out.
The American carrier-based aircraft made certain that the Japanese would not reinforce their positions on the island.
Our job in the magazine was to get powder and shells up to the gun. We were sealed in. We were 3 or 4 decks down in this magazine. We would have to really work hard when it was an air attack because the 5-inch guns were shooting bam, bam, bam real fast, and we just had to get the powder up there to them.
The men shut up in the North Carolina and in other battleships during an air attack could track the Japanese planes coming closer and closer by listening to the guns. First the 5-inch, then the more rapid 40 millimeter, and finally the deck-mounted 20 millimeter as the planes that survived came within close range. Fall 1942. The battle for Guadalcanal wears on. The Japanese send one of their most powerful battleships, the Kirishima, to bombard the American air base at Henderson Field. On the nights of 14 and 15 November, between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, the battleships Washington and South Dakota engage in a gun duel at point-blank range with the Japanese force. The South Dakota is severely damaged, and the 4 American destroyers accompanying the 2 battleships are disabled in 20 minutes. The destroyer Preston took several direct hits before she sank. Her combat cameraman, Robert Reed, was thrown into the water. For nearly 3 hours, he watched the action.
It was a duel between the Washington and the Kirishima. The Kirishima was outgunned. Her 14-inchers could not penetrate the Washington's steel-armored belt. The 16-inchers of the Washington did penetrate the 14-inch belt of the Kirishima and spelled her doom. She apparently burned and exploded until she finally went down, according to the battle reports, around 3 a.m. or 3:30.
Throughout 1943, the Allied offensive grows ever stronger. American technology and training overwhelm the enemy. In the fall, the Allies begin the Central Pacific Campaign, a march through the Japanese-held atolls north of the equator, only 750 miles from the enemy homeland. Part of the American effort will rest with a new class of battleships, the Iowa class. The Americans had long been wary of Japanese plans in the Pacific. When 4 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan began to build 3 large battleships, the United States increased the size of its battleships to 45,000 tons, their guns to 16 inches. The result was a new class of battleship named for the first of their kind, the USS Iowa. More than 5 years in design and construction, the Iowa and the Missouri would be built in the New York Navy Yard, the New Jersey and Wisconsin in Philadelphia. Up to 10,000 people had a hand in the construction of each ship. The Missouri alone required 3 million man-days of work. In recognition of the threat from enemy aircraft, the 4 Iowa-class ships had been designed with an emphasis on the protection of their turrets, machinery, and magazines against aerial bombs. The heaviest armor was more than 6 inches thick. 2 huge belts along the sides were angled inboard to provide protection equal to 13.5 inches of steel. The plates that were locked together to make up the belts weighed 50 tons each. The huge crane was at its limit as it positioned them to be welded in place. Because all of the Iowas entered service late in the war, each was equipped with the newest technology, including surface and air search radar that could track enemy aircraft 100 miles away. Each of the 3 turrets on an Iowa-class ship contained 3 of the newest 16-inch guns, the most powerful guns ever mounted on a U.S. warship. With its improved range, an armor-piercing shell from one of the new 16-inch guns was said to be capable of penetrating 32 feet of reinforced concrete. The Iowas had the greatest anti-aircraft capability of any ship in World War II. Their secondary armament included 25-inch guns in 10 twin mounts and 130 smaller anti-aircraft guns. They were fast, and they could cruise great distances without refueling. Their top speed was 33 knots, the fastest battleships in the world. And their range at 12 knots was an incredible 18,000 miles. The new battleships were run by crews of over 2,000 men. The Iowa-class battleships would see action in the Pacific in the closing months of World War II. By 1944, in the Philippine Sea, the fast carriers fighter planes, supported by the battleship's anti-aircraft fire, were destroying the heart of Japanese naval aviation. Now the Americans begin to feel the extent of Japan's desperation. Naval historian Paul Stilwell.
In the autumn of 1944, as the Americans got into the Philippines, the Japanese were so desperate in their defensive stance that they inaugurated the Corps of Kamikazes, planes flown by men who were in effect human fire control systems for the bombs they carried. They were deliberately willing to sacrifice their lives because of the code of the warrior that said dying for the emperor was the highest honor.
On 24 October, a force of 259 carrier-based American bombers and torpedo planes attacked 4 of Japan's largest battleships in the Sibuyan Sea. The American pilots concentrate on Musashi as she falls behind the others. After 9 hours of unrelenting punishment, the great Japanese man-of-war, ravaged by 20 torpedoes and 10 bombs, rolls over and sinks. Oil and debris from the Musashi still float on the water the next day when a Japanese fleet of 4 destroyers, a cruiser, and 2 battleships steam through a narrow strait called Surigao. The Japanese are unaware that at the north end of the strait, the Americans have assembled 8 cruisers, 26 destroyers, and 6 battleships. It is a textbook trap. Ed Snyder was at Surigao Strait.
We had very good intelligence which indicated to us which way the forces had to come. This forced the Japanese forces carrying the amphibious attack, led by some battleships, to come up through a strait, a very narrow strait, so narrow that the battleships could not turn. They had to stay within the channel.
I, as gunnery officer, was tracking the Japanese lead battleship through the optics of the rangefinder, which in effect was a sight. I had it in the crosshairs, and it suddenly occurred to me that that the pagoda-like mast of this Japanese ship was absolutely filling the optics, and we were that close. And as I recall thinking, my God, that looks just like the pagoda mast of a Japanese battleship that I learned about in recognition class back at the Naval Academy. And then I thought, well, that's exactly what it is. And it's shooting back at us.
It was at Surigao Strait that battleships last used the classic formation of crossing the T. Crossing the T is a maneuver invented over a century and a half ago. By coming across the enemy's bow, battleships could fire broadsides while the enemy could only fire their forward guns. At Surigao Strait, the Americans crossed the T on the Japanese.
We saw these tracers going through the sky, and they were coming from our battleships and all converging on the Japanese battleships.